It seems that knowledge-based journalism assumes lots of agency from the journalists. They should educate themselves to report better. But it seems to me there are bigger forces affecting the job of the journalist as business, like the owners, the business model, politic forces. How those forces affect, in the end, what a journalist can do in his profession?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and it goes to some of the other questions that have been asked. I mean, those are huge forces out there, and it depends on how you count. But by one accounting, there are a third fewer journalists today than there were 10 or 15 years ago. It gives you a sense of the amount of attrition that's occurred in traditional news organizations. So there's a lot of pressures, I think. And in part, that's, I think, the reason why we place so much emphasis on the education process. That's the point where these kinds of pressures are less intense. I mean, the minute you graduate, of course, you get into that world of quite intense pressures, and obviously, whether there's anything out there for you after you've spent 4 years of your life doing this. But I think that's where we think the real change is going to take place. It's much harder to learn these things on the job. And in some ways, that was the answer, or part of the answer, to the old problem of yellow journalism, the Columbia Journalism School, the School of Journalism at Missouri. Those were kind of founded in part in response to or in reaction to this runaway journalism that you could see on the streets of New York during the great newspaper wars of the early 1900s, late 1900s and early 20th century. So those are undeniable forces, and they're big ones, right? And other schools have done this. I mean, it's not like you can't make the change. About a half century ago, business schools faced pretty much the same kind of challenge. I mean, the business school model was largely a faculty that had been out in the business world and came back into the university and basically talked about their lessons learned. And if you look at business schools today, that's still much of what they teach, and they should. Just as if you look at a journalism school faculty, a lot of the faculty members are former journalists, right, who have come into the classroom now to pass on the lessons that they learned while they were active in the news industry. But what the business schools did was to say, that's not enough. We've got to also bring economics into our curriculum. We've got to bring organizational and management theory into our curriculum. They fundamentally kind of redid what a business school education looks like, right? It wasn't easy. It's never easy to kind of bridge those divides, make those connections. And if you look at the studies, and they're still studying it 50 years later or so, there's still some problems with it. It's not easy. But there's no one today in a journalism school would say, we got to go back to where we were 50 years ago. That's unthinkable, all right? And what would be nice is if 50 years hence, looking back on journalism education, you make pretty much the same kind of claim about, no, we would never go back to that model. That was not sufficient. It was not up to the challenges that journalists face in today's environment. It's not only that they need how to go gather the story and tell the story and disseminate the story, but they got to understand more deeply what they're reporting on if their stories are to be relevant, trustworthy, providing the kind of information that citizens need.